Of all the Switch 2 upgrades we reviewed to date, Zelda, Breath of the Wild and its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, rank among the most satisfying. It's taken a little while to properly sit down with this Zelda double bill, owing to the deluge of other Switch 2 games to cover at launch, but that's really no reflection on Nintendo's efforts here. From the outset, it's clear that both games get several highly practical upgrades. Boosted resolutions, a push to 60 frames per second, improved visual settings, snappier loading times, HDR support, plus integration with a neatly presented Zelda Notes mobile app. Most of these visual changes are rather straightforward in nature, but most notably in Tears of the Kingdom's case, Switch 2 makes a colossal difference in fixing the sub 30 FPS drop seen on original Switch hardware. Despite the more complex, physics-based contraptions possible in this 2023 follow-up, Switch 2 now allows for a convincing 60 FPS reading instead. There is one catch, however, that these extras are not given out for free. Unlike the automatic res and performance boost possible while playing certain other Switch 1 titles on Switch 2 hardware, like Super Mario Odyssey for example, both Zelda games demand that you buy a specific Switch 2 edition, or upgrade your original Switch version for $10 or £8 via the eShop. It's worth it, I'd say, especially for Tears of the Kingdom, but what precisely are we getting in return? What are the visual improvements and resolution boosts for each game, and how drastic are the gains in frame rate? Let's find out. Let's tackle the comparisons head on. Switch 2 keeps a dynamic resolution setup in place as per the original Switch release, but with a higher range to better support 4K displays. For context, on the original Switch, both Zelda titles target 900p while in docked mode, with scope to drop to 720p where the GPU is taxed. The good news is that Switch 2 boosts those numbers drastically across both games, putting us at 1440p at peak, with drops to 810p in the absolute extreme cases, like triggering the Ultra Hand ability while travelling through a busy forested area. It's worth noting that such low numbers like 810p are rare, but likelier in the more demanding sequel, while Breath of the Wild tends to veer closer to 1440p. The upshot then is that in terms of raw pixel output, Switch 2's freshly fabricated Tegra T239 chipset is leveraged to produce a sharper frame while in docked mode. It's seriously great stuff. Key landmarks across Hyrule's skyline are easier to decipher, and likewise for collecting items, like misfired arrows on the floor, the res boost is a great help. One odd quirk is worth mentioning here. In Tears of the Kingdom, it's been noticed that the resolution will at times suddenly tank to a low value, even if briefly during cutscenes. For a few frames during a camera view change, the frame flips to a blurrier 810p output, and then quickly restores to a native 1440p once again. So, if you do notice the image arbitrarily softening and sharpening at points, this is why. Perhaps it's a bug or a byproduct of the game's DRS system in handling changes in camera view, but thankfully, controllable gameplay isn't affected. Also, looking at the handheld experience on Switch 2, we get a resolution upgrade here as well. On Switch 2, we have a range of 648p to 1080p, which is a decent upgrade on the 576p to 720p range on original Switch hardware. That 648p low point on Switch 2 again triggers while using the Ultra Hand ability in complex spaces, though in fairness, it often hits a native 1080p in more barren open world areas and shrines. There is one further downside, sadly. While Switch 2's resolution boost is a great foundation for its image quality overall, anti-aliasing in both Zelda titles ranges from ineffective to virtually non-existent, often leaving pixel crawl in view. Looking at Tears of the Kingdom's intellectual property notices page in fact, there's evidence to suggest Switch 2 is still using AMD's FSR1 upscaling tech seen on the original Switch. And meanwhile, there's no mention of any upscaler in Breath of the Wild's notes, which makes sense of course given that the game originally predated FSR1's release. In Breath of the Wild's case, we appear to have a generic bilinear upscale on the original Switch, which translates to the Switch 2 version. The point being, there's no sign of Nvidia's DLSS or any more recent upscaling tech in either game, which is a missed opportunity given the hardware support for it. FSR 1, in Tears of the Kingdom's case, at least grants it a spatial upscale and some image enhancements, but it lacks the temporal data drawn from multiple frames to actually intelligently treat that aliasing, the pixel crawl and visual noise. Again, it's a missed opportunity and leaves a lot of distracting flicker in view, though the res boost alone, up to 1440p at peak, does go a long way to improve visibility over the original Switch versions at least. Looking beyond resolutions, there are several graphics improvements on Switch 2. Firstly, textures across the environment are replaced with higher resolution assets. It means that the install package of this Switch 2 edition inevitably balloons in size, and so Breath of the Wild, for example, expands from 14GB in its original state to 24GB, while Tears of the Kingdom goes from 16GB to 20. This new install package is perhaps what distinguishes both Zelda games from most free upgrades for Switch 2, and the results speak for themselves. Everything from grass, brickwork, cloth, the materials on towers, and even shield decals sport a sharper design. Characters are less evidently improved meanwhile, though their flat, cel-shaded aesthetic already scales pretty well to a 4K display as is. You might also notice texture filtering is still sadly stuck on a rather low setting, with an obvious blur to the ground ahead, but the upgraded textures are a big win in viewing anything up close, and crucial in matching the higher resolution window on Switch 2. Next along, there's the boosted shadow quality. Both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom use a day-night cycle, with all shadows dynamically casting from terrain, swaying trees, and characters. However, rendering shadows in real time like this is a taxing endeavour, and on the original Switch, shadows run at a low resolution, creating flicker on movement. Plus, an obvious filtering cascade is deployed here, which causes shadows to appear blurred and degraded in quality further away. Switch 2 addresses this to an extent by increasing the resolution of nearby shadows, so they're cleaner, sharper, and this boost is immediately evident in Tears of the Kingdom's Great Sky Island area. But it's not problem solved by any means. Even with this upgrade in place, shadows flicker quite visibly on Switch 2, and again, a shadow filtering cascade line is obviously in view ahead, leading to a change in quality right in front of Link. It must be said that shadows are still the roughest, most distracting part of the visual package in both Zelda games, even in their Switch 2 form today. Speaking on shadows, another significant change is in Switch 2's ambient occlusion. This primarily affects the shading of interiors, with more prominent pockets of shade now filling out the gaps in the walls around the Shrine of Resurrection. The original Switch release always had a screen space AO in place to add depth to the scene, and so it remains, but the effect is now thicker, fuller on Switch 2 in these very same moments. Rounding out, a final word on the game's draw distances while exploring Hyrule. In matching runs across terrain, you'll notice that tree and geometry LODs swap between quality levels at the exact same point in the world on both systems. It suggests a very limited change in LOD setup for the Switch 2 edition at best. There are instances where grass draws slightly further afield on Switch 2, or a bit of geometry might load in faster, but for a majority of elements like bushes, trees, rocks, the draw distance is often identical to the original Switch. A panning shot of the surrounding terrain bears this out, and above all else, it's the resolution boost, improved textures, shadows, and ambient occlusion that makes the biggest change. Moving on to performance testing, let's start with the biggest stress test of the two games, Tears of the Kingdom. The fact of the matter is that this latter-day Switch release truly pushes the CPU limits of the original console. The game's ultra-hand ability, plus the fusing together of parts to forge custom contraptions, to this day spells disaster for the original Switch's frame rate at points. Open world spaces admittedly often run well enough at the target 30 FPS, but throw these abilities into the mix even as early on as the opening Sky Island tutorial, and we're running at a flat 20 FPS instead. A double buffer VSync is deployed here, meaning that if a 33.3 millisecond render budget per frame is missed, the renderer updates every 50 milliseconds instead, and hence these long bouts at 20 FPS. It's not simply physics-based stuff either. Battles run poorly on the original system too, where simply striking an enemy drops frames, and larger encounters tank its reading to 20 FPS again. Tears of the Kingdom saw Switch out of its depth in 2023 for these moments, and more so than the original game, Breath of the Wild, it was crying out for a generational leap in hardware to fix it. Running all these very same scenarios over again on Switch 2, it's problem solved. More than that, in fact, the doubling in frame rate to 60 FPS is capably held up in early battles, alongside the use of that Ultra Hand ability. Switch 2's lock at 60 barely wavers here, and while the vast scope of the game, plus the myriad ways you might use the Ultra Hand later on with contraptions downloaded from the Zelda Notes app, could lead to drops, the outlook is very positive early on. Based on the opening 5 to 6 hours leading to exploration around Hyrule on the ground level, it does feel transformative coming from the 30 FPS on the original Switch. The Sky Island tutorial plays out like an early stress test in some ways, forcing you to build all manner of boats and rail carts, but even here, there's only the briefest blip under 60 to speak on. Tracking back to Breath of the Wild, this 2017 game doesn't push the original Switch quite as hard. Fully patched up today, it's also in a much better optimized state than at launch, and so retesting areas like Zora's Domain or Kakariko Village, which both did drop on release, we're now looking at a better 30 FPS lock. That being said, it's still easy to trigger sub-30 drops on the original Switch by, say, exploding barrels near clusters of enemies, and it's here that the Tegra X1 struggles. Swapping over to Switch 2 then, the situation is pretty straightforward. We're getting a flat 60 in all these very same key areas, and given the fewer variables in its physics-based puzzling, the chances of a drop are lessened too. It's worth stressing that performance in both games holds up just as well on Switch 2 while in portable mode. Exact frame rate testing isn't viable here in handheld mode, given that there's no 60 FPS video feed we can use to track drops, but going by eye, this is just as robust as the docked experience. The icing on the cake is the promise of speedier loading times, and Switch 2 delivers here. With the digital version installed to each console's internal storage, it takes Switch 2 just 11 seconds to finish an initial load to the Great Plateau Tower, up against the 23 seconds on the original Switch, halving the wait. Better yet, for fast travel between shrines, this is an even bigger boon for overall playability. Fast travelling to the Shrine of Resurrection takes Switch 2 a similar 11 seconds, while the original Switch model eventually loads in at 19 seconds. Curiously, a test of Tears of the Kingdom reveals an even starker improvement here. Switch 2's initial load to the Lookout Landing Skyview Tower takes 8 seconds, which is a third of the wait compared to the original Switch at 26 seconds. The higher bandwidth to Switch 2's internal storage is a clear advantage in this sense, but it's all the more impressive of course given that Switch 2 is loading more data to its RAM in the form of those high quality textures. The upgraded Switch 2 editions of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom justify the cost of entry, but there are limits to their ambition. The good news is that for those who held off playing this new wave of Zelda titles until now, Switch 2 offers a perfect jumping on point. The boost to 60 FPS, especially in Tears of the Kingdom where it's been so greatly needed, is a huge leap over the original Switch's 20 to 30 FPS range. However, and despite the embellishments in texture and shadow quality, rough points do remain in both games. Aliasing is still an issue for Switch 2, with pixel crawl in view not helped by a rudimentary upscale in both games. And there's plenty of flickering on shadows as well. Not much more to say on this one, but it is a shame that Nintendo didn't push to address these issues. Still, the benefits of the Switch 2 upgrade stand as a heavy counterweight to any critiques we might have. These are Game of the Year winning titles for their respective years of release after all, and in enhanced form, only add to a growing list of reasons to jump to Nintendo's new machine. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.